Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Egypt. I'm Mike Hanna. Despite days of shuttle diplomacy and intensive phone calls in the Egyptian capital, Cairo, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry was unable to broker a long-term Gaza truce. He's been holding talks with his Egyptian counterpart, Sameh Shoukry, as well as UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon. The U.S. Secretary of State then flew to Paris on Saturday, where he's continuing diplomatic efforts. Kerry's plan is seen as an update to a proposal already tabled by Egypt. And though it was rejected by Israel, he says he remains hopeful.
We still have some terminology in the context of the framework to work through. But we are confident we have a fundamental framework that can and will ultimately work. And what we need to do is continue to work for that.
Egypt has a record of playing mediator between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And despite questions about how honest a broker it is, the country continues to play a role. Geography is a key factor in that role. Egypt's Sinai Peninsula borders the Gaza Strip, and Egypt is as much a party to the conflict as it is a mediator. It controls Gaza's Rafah crossing, which Hamas is demanding be opened permanently. John Kerry's plan sees Egypt continuing in the role of broker in long-term negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But Cairo's relationship with Hamas is at its lowest point, and the group is widely demonized on Egyptian state media. For more on this, I'm joined by our guests. From Washington, D.C., Graeme Bannerman, scholar at the Middle East Institute and former Middle East Analyst at the State Department. And from Berlin, Sarah Eltantawi, Assistant Professor of Comparative Religion at Evergreen State College. Welcome to you both. Let's begin with Sarah Eltantawi. As mentioned there, Egypt is not just a mediator in this conflict. Some would argue that it is also very much a party. What is your view?
Yes, I would agree that Egypt is very much a party. Of course, so is the United States. I just want to put that out there. I know that the topic today is Egypt, but the idea that the United States is an honest broker is actually the one that we should be deconstructing the most here. But since we're talking about Egypt, yes, it's obviously a party. It controls the Rafah crossing, and I do not agree with the current policy of the regime in Egypt to keep that crossing completely closed, even to medical supplies and to the Palestinian injured in this assault on Gaza. And I really can't find any reason from a security point of view, from a security standpoint in Egypt, why a very minimal allowance of injured from the Gaza Strip and for medical supplies to be sent through. It seems to me to be a kind of nose-thumbing at Hamas rather than a humanitarian strategy that's befitting of a great state. And I'm concerned, I'm not somebody who doesn't understand the security concerns posed by Hamas and Islamist groups in the region. On the contrary, I do understand those concerns. But there's a kind of level of pettiness here that I'm concerned about. We first saw it with, for example, it reminds me of the sentencing of the over 500 supposed members of the Muslim Brotherhood by a judiciary in Minya in Egypt. It was a petty move, a symbolic move to try to assert control and to show that the Egyptian state is strong, but what it ended up doing is undermining the Egyptian judiciary. And I feel that this is similar with much more grave consequences. Now we have thousands of injured some of whom could have been treated in Egypt, and yet you have this policy it's aimed to kind of thumb-nose Hamas, and that might have some kind of short-term emotional gain for the Egyptian regime and its supporters, but at the cost of Egypt's strategic importance in the region.
Well, let's go to Graeme Bannerman.
And its
first
own
of all, to Graeme Bannerman, but first of all, the question about, do you see Egypt as a clear party in this ongoing conflict?
Well, clearly, Egypt has strategic interest in what happens in Gaza, what happens in the peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. This has always been central to the Egyptian policy, and I think it remains central. I think the complaint today is that Egypt is not playing the same role that it has in the past because of other considerations, which are the Islamic rebellion it's having in its own country.
Well, Sarah Eltantawi, I want to get back to what you said right at the beginning there, that the US is also a party in this conflict, something that you said needs to be discussed too. And yet it is Egypt that the US is using as a proxy in these mediations, as it has done on past occasions, has it not?
It has, because of course the Camp David Accord and the entire security state apparatus in the Middle East that's been put in place for the security of Israel, supposedly. I don't think this obviously does not make Israel secure, but that's another story. That entire security apparatus and logic that's now in place in the Middle East is of course predicated on Egyptian cooperation, and Egypt is receiving billions of dollars also in aid from the United States for their participation in this order. But Mubarak, for example, was able to negotiate that line. I wouldn't say, for example, that the Mubarak regime acted always as simply a proxy of the United States. Egypt, despite the fact that it does take so much aid from the United States, has played an independent role in brokering ceasefires and attempts at the peace process, which is something else we need to discuss, moribund at this point. But sticking with Egypt, Mubarak played that role, I think, a bit more smartly and in a way that allowed Egypt to maintain a kind of independent policy in the region. And my concern here is that I agree with what your guest just said. There has been a shift, and it looks to me as if Egypt is not only acting as a proxy, I wouldn't call it that necessarily, of the United States, but really also of the Netanyahu administration in Israel. And that is a red line, both strategically for Egypt, because Egypt's interests are not Israel's interests completely, and also morally.
Well, Graeme Bannerman, I want to return to that point that you brought up, the change that has happened in Egypt, where the last ceasefire that was negotiated by Egypt, Mohamed Morsi was in power, close relations with Hamas. Now that has reversed completely. To what extent has the political shifts in Egypt affected attempts to create ceasefires between Israel and Gaza?
I think it's more than the shift in Egypt. I think what's happened is, please understand, the negotiations of the last ceasefire agreement, yes, it was given credit to President Morsi, but in fact it was done by the military who negotiated it. The relationship between Hamas and Egypt has predominantly been over the years through the military and military intelligence. The problem for Egypt and from Hamas in particular right now is that Hamas is seen as allied with those forces that are opposed to Egyptian nationalism, and that's what you get the irrational attacks upon Hamas in the Egyptian media is because of it. Hamas is seen as opposed to Egyptian nationalism. So what you have now is Hamas needs Egypt, and Egypt would like to work with the Palestinians. That's why they supported the joint government between Fatah and Hamas. That was a good thing. But when Hamas continues to say we support the opposition forces in Egypt, it makes it very difficult for the Egyptians to come to their assistance at this point.
Well, Sarah Eltantawi, that issue about the media in Egypt demonizing Hamas, it has done it regularly in recent weeks, it's done it regularly in the past, very much advancing the argument that Hamas is working together with the Muslim Brotherhood to subvert the state of Egypt. Is this part of an Egyptian strategy, do you believe?
Yes, it's part of a current Egyptian strategy. This is a complicated situation. It is true that had the Morsi regime continued, there may have been alliances between the Morsi regime and Hamas and other Islamist regional players that may have been very problematic for the Egyptian state. I do not believe that that is a far-fetched thing to worry about. In this case, however, while that's also true, one also must distinguish between these groups, and one also must put them in context and understand what's going on at any particular moment. Hamas right now, though it's handled itself in the Palestinian territories in ways that polls show even Palestinians, of course before this incursion by Israel, criticized, the fact is the disproportionate response from Israel, the civilian casualties and the displacements that strongly suggest that Netanyahu is not working in Israel's security interests. After all, we've now found out that the 3 kidnapped Israelis were not kidnapped by Hamas. So what's happened now, which really should be the point here, is something that is part and parcel of an Israeli strategy of ethnic cleansing in the Palestinian territories, and Hamas plays its own particular role in that story. But Egypt, the great government and country of Egypt, should not be reduced to playing a kind of tit-for-tat revenge game with Hamas and its possible alliances with the Muslim Brotherhood had it stayed in power. Now, what you'll hear in the Egyptian media is that the attacks on our soldiers, the attacks in Sinai, it's all been conflated now. We don't really know who carried out those attacks. I happen to think that those look to me as if they are attacks by Islamists. I don't believe they're all or even mostly or maybe at all false flag operations. I'm not saying that. They are probably Islamist operations, but we don't know who did them. And to conflate all of the Islamist groups and say, well, this is Hamas, and Hamas is the same as Al-Qaeda, and Hamas is the same as ISIS, which is also being said, is ridiculous. And it's a dumbing down of journalism in Egypt and of the information level in Egypt, and nobody, nationalist or otherwise, who's concerned about Egypt can stand with that.
Well, Graeme Bannerman, this issue about Egypt keeping Rafah blocked, keeping it blocked even to humanitarian convoys, there are many who are arguing that by doing so, Egypt is in fact backing the ongoing Israeli occupation. If Rafah was free and open, there would be an avenue of access for Gazans to remove into the wide world. With that remaining closed, it is part, it would appear, of certainly physically backing the occupation of Israel.
Well, there's just two things. One is factually wrong. They have allowed medical supplies to go into Gaza. I think a 10-truck convoy went in at least today or yesterday, and others have come out over the time. It is not as open as it has been in the past. I think what's important, though, is to understand the usage of words with regard to Gaza. Too many times we make mistakes in the vocabulary we use. Egypt and Israel both have control of their own borders. At different times, they either embargo the trade or they lessen the embargo, but they have some control over that trade. That is natural in international relations. The problem for Gaza is, since the day the Israelis withdrew, they have maintained a naval and sea blockade. The difference is a blockade prevents third parties from trading with Gaza. So Gaza has been embargoed on two sides and then blockaded on the others, and therefore they have been totally isolated as a prison camp. What Hamas has done here is they have brought the focus onto the blockade. And the blockade under international law is an act of war. The embargo is a policy decision. We may agree or disagree with the Egyptians and the Israelis on the embargo, but they have a right to do that. The blockade is an act of war, and that needs to be addressed just as much as the rockets and the shelling of Gaza.
Well, Sarah Eltantawi, do you agree with that very clearly enunciated division between blockade and act of war?
Yes, I would agree with that. We're here to discuss the debatable part of this, which is the Egyptian government's choice to keep Rafah closed up until very recently for very few supplies, relatively speaking. Many more lives could have been saved. My concern as someone who has been following the developments in Egypt over the past few years is that I'm concerned with the reduction in the stature of the Egyptian state and the decision-making that is based in very, very, very narrow interests, and it doesn't seem to be as concerned about playing a more robust regional role, and of the increasing levels of paranoia and inaccuracies in the Egyptian media.
Well, Graeme Bannerman, that's an important point because for a long period of time, Arab nations have defined themselves and their credibility and their legitimacy many times in terms of their opposition to Israel. Egypt did that in the past. It does appear it is no longer doing that within the wider Arab community. Opposition to Israel is seen by many as a form of legitimacy. Egypt is backing down on this to a certain extent, it would appear. Is it losing its status, as Sarah Eltantawi said there, as a major power in the region?
I think that Egyptians have always been in the forefront of those who have criticized the Israeli actions against the Palestinians. I think the Egyptians will be critical at this point. But there's another wider regional issues that are going on that make them moderate what they say publicly, and that is the whole rise of this Islamic fundamentalist movement so people no longer identify themselves as Arabs, they identify themselves as Muslims. With this the Egyptians find themselves as a nation state trying to struggle to maintain their identity in a sea of people are changing their own self-identity.
Sarah Eltantawi, is there the possibility that Egypt would be happier dealing as mediator with the Palestinian Authority? There is a unity government, has been declared within Palestine. Would Egypt be happier with the suggestions, for example, that the PA controls the Rafah crossing point in deed as well as in action? Is that something that could be the game changer in terms of Egypt's position in forcing through or pushing through a ceasefire and opening up Rafah?
It does strongly seem that the Sisi regime would definitely rather deal with the Palestinian Authority. But I think that what this very, very disturbing action in the Gaza Strip has shown us is that, I think that we've entered a new phase, really, of the Arab Spring, which is that criticism of the Israeli policies and the longest-running occupation in the modern world, in modern history, is something that has become more mainstream, and that there's a fear barrier that has been broken around that. And I still think there is an Arab Spring. I still think that the region is going through tremendous important changes, some of which are quite negative. But one of the logics that is really starting to come apart is this logic of the peace process in the first place, and the alliances that have formed around which factions in the peace process. So, for example, the Palestinian Authority, which has up until 2 nights ago attempted to suppress, for example, protests in the West Bank about what happened in Gaza, and real questions are being raised about the role that Abbas has taken in what Israel has done in the Gaza Strip. There's a lot of questioning now about the Palestinian Authority's legitimacy and moral stance even within the Palestinian territories. I just think that the Sisi regime, which is controversial, I've been on here before explaining from the Egyptian perspective why people voted for Sisi and the perception of the threat that is there by pan-Islamist groups, and I believe that threat is there. But we need to be very careful to see wider trends in what's happening in the region and real tectonic shifts that are taking place and different emphases. And one of the things that's really changing is that there's just a lot less patience with the logic of the peace process and of the security state apparatus that has been put in place by a certain kind of logic of Western foreign policy since really 1967, namely oil, Israel, and security. That order is really starting to come apart, and Egypt needs to get ahead of that sort of dissembling now in order to remain a regional power and also for its own security and to maintain itself as a state.
Well, as part of these tectonic shifts referred to there, Graeme Bannerman, we have seen in recent days a higher profile from Turkey and indeed from Qatar in terms of helping to or attempting to help push the ceasefire or truce process forward. Is this perhaps part of something wider that Egypt stands a danger of losing its position in whatever form of negotiations were in place before this latest round of conflict, and could do so in the future with the emergence of other forces within the region who could perhaps be more effective in negotiating a form of truce or ceasefire? Your view?
Turkey and Qatar are important because they have good relations with Hamas and they can talk to them, and that's their essential role. But I don't think any of that replaces Egypt as a crucial fulcrum of issues within the Middle East. But for the Egyptian point of view, they have to be secure and strong as a state at home, and therefore they first must address the internal problems they're facing. When you sit in Cairo and you look at the world and the changes in Libya, which are chaotic and causing huge problems on your western border, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, they say they made a decision in the election of Sisi. And the decision was, we're going to be Egyptians, we're going to be firm at home, and we're going to maintain our Egyptian nationalism in the face of all of these other movements. That will be their priority until they get stability at home, and the problems they face are huge, and it's questionable whether they'll be able to address them. But they have to address those first. Gaza then now becomes a secondary issue, and as the Israelis. And the Israelis are a secondary issue. I don't think the Egyptians will ever back down for criticizing the Israelis for their treatment of the Palestinians. I don't think anybody in Cairo, from Assisi to anybody else, is comfortable with the failure of the Israelis to live up to their past agreements with the Palestinian Authority. That said, it's not their priority.
Sarah Eltantawi, on that particular point, do you think that the LCC government is threatened by the emergence of players like Turkey, like Qatar?
Yes, I think they are, and it is indeed a threat to have governments like these, which have shown a real lack of diplomacy and have been very narrow in their interests as well, rise like this. But I do agree with most of what your guest said, except that I'm afraid that I can't really agree with the last part, that Egyptian society is shying away from criticizing Israel, or always will. Many, many, many people of conscience do. But I've been very disturbed with what I have seen in the media. I've seen justifications for Israel bombing hospitals on the media in Egypt. I've seen very, very spurious arguments that have absolutely no reference or relationship whatsoever to international law about Israel's right to just take out terrorists. Palestinians have been conflated. Hamas are all blanketly terrorists, and everyone, the Israeli logic is being basically reproduced here. So I really see that as problematic. I also disagree slightly with another point that was just made, which is that, yes, Gaza is a secondary issue, and I agree. I absolutely agree that Sisi was elected because Egyptians en masse made a decision that they are going to kind of foreground a nationalist Egyptian identity. I've been trying to argue that for a year now. But I think that this was a misstep with Hamas, because even, normally the Egyptian government knows when, and this is something Mubarak was quite good at, knows when to even make that symbolic, cosmetic gesture that would quiet the streets, for example. And here, absolutely leaving the Rafah crossing closed while the worst bombing and bombardments were happening in Gaza for the past few days is really unprecedented. It was such a it's just such a kind of unjustifiable diplomatic nose thumbing once again, and it would not have cost anything for Egypt in terms of security to let in more medical convoys earlier on and to let in the Palestinian injured. And I just think that is a misstep that will really cost Egypt's reputation in the region in ways that do not in any way help Egyptian standing or Egypt as a nationalist state or anything else.
Well, Graeme Bannerman, partly in conclusion, do you see Egypt as losing its standing in terms of its action in recent days, and particularly in relation to the Gaza conflict?
No, I don't. I think what Egypt is going to act in its own national interest. The problem for the people in the region is they're not acting the way they did in the past, and therefore people are unhappy with Egypt. If Egypt chooses to change its policy, Egypt is Egypt. It will have a central role, and that will continue. It may not be the role that some of the people in the region want, but it's still there.
Sarah Eltantawi, a final point from you. Is Egypt going to be part of what happens past a ceasefire in terms of an attempt to resume negotiations that are totally moribund?
I hope so. I shy away now from making very long-term predictions, but I think that what has happened in this last round with Gaza has not been in Egypt's long-term interests, and I hope that there will be a grassroots campaign to reverse course and for Egypt to have a wider conception of what its policy is for the region and what's in its best interests.
Well, at that particular point, my thanks to our guests, Graeme Bannerman and Sarah Eltantawi. And remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Egypt and Gaza on air and online. I'm Hanna. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.